Most advice says, look outward, find your passion, chase your purpose. But Carl Jung suggested something far deeper. Feeling lost isn't a sign that you're failing, it's a signal. A message from your psyche that your life has drifted away from its true center. Jung called that center the self, not something you discover like a new hobby, but an inner presence that has been shaping you since before your conscious ego ever existed. This is why so much self-help feels hollow. It tries to expand the ego, when real transformation comes from aligning with the self, the deeper blueprint of who you already are. So the question isn't, how do I find myself? The question is, how do I return to the inner center that has been guiding me all along? Every morning you wake up with preferences that feel completely natural to you. Why you're drawn to certain colors over others. Why specific pieces of music move you, while others leave you cold. Why some conversations energize you, while others drain you so completely that you need hours alone just to recover. These aren't random quirks that develop through trial and error. They're expressions of something deeper. Most people assume personality develops through experience and learning, building from nothing into something coherent over time. You start as a blank slate, then family interactions shape you, school experiences mold you, relationships teach you who you are. Each encounter adds another layer until you finally become a complete person with clear preferences, values, and ways of being in the world. But Jung discovered something that challenges this entire assumption. Think about how a seed contains the entire blueprint of a tree. Every branch, every leaf pattern, every seasonal cycle is encoded in that tiny package before it ever touches soil. Yet the tree must still grow through seasons of expansion and contraction, responding to weather, reaching toward light. The blueprint guides the growth, but growth still happens. Your psyche works in the same way as the seed and the tree. Jung described the self as something that exists before the ego, a presence that can't be fully explained but can always be felt. It doesn't just hold your memories or preferences. It holds the thread of continuity that makes you feel like the same person across the years, even as everything in your life changes. Jung made a clear distinction between the ego and the deeper self. Your ego is the everyday narrator, the voice that says, I want coffee, I need to call my mother, I'm frustrated at work. It feels like the decision maker. But the self is something larger. Think of it as the conductor of a symphony. The ego is just one instrument playing its part. The conductor holds the whole score, knows when each section should come in, and shapes how the music unfolds. The ego may believe it's running the show, but it's actually following cues from the self, the deeper center that has been shaping your patterns, preferences, and choices since long before you were conscious of them. And when the ego pulls in a direction that clashes with the self, that's when we feel lost, stuck, or strangely out of sync with our own lives. Your unconscious mind organizes your entire personality without you knowing it. That friend who instantly irritates you isn't triggering random annoyance. That career path that looks perfect on paper but feels wrong in your body isn't failing due to lack of motivation. That relationship pattern you keep repeating despite swearing you'll do things differently next time isn't happening because you're weak or unconscious. Your feelings of being lost often signal that your ego has drifted away from this deeper organizing principle. You've spent so much energy trying to become who you think you should be that you've lost touch with who you actually are at the foundational level. The preferences, attractions, and natural rhythms that were always there get buried under layers of social conditioning and ego-driven goal setting. This explains why traditional goal setting sometimes feels so hollow. You're trying to impose direction from the outside instead of aligning with what's already there. You set goals based on what sounds impressive, or what worked for someone else, or what your family expects, then wonder why achieving them leaves you feeling empty rather than fulfilled. The exhaustion many people feel doesn't come from working too hard, it comes from working against themselves. From pouring energy into directions that clash with their deeper nature. But when your effort lines up with your inner blueprint, life starts to flow. Action feels natural instead of forced. Understanding this changes how you approach the feeling of being lost. Instead of seeing it as evidence that you lack direction, you can recognize it as information that your ego has moved too far from your center. The solution isn't finding something new, it's remembering something that was always there. But recognizing this organizing principle is only the beginning. The real challenge comes when you realize that what worked for you at 25 might be exactly what's blocking you at 35. Jung mapped out how this shift happens. He observed that human development follows a predictable two-phase structure. Each phase carries different psychological tasks and sources of meaning. Most people accept that childhood differs from adulthood, but Jung argued adulthood itself contains two distinct phases, each as different from the other as childhood is from adulthood, other as either is from childhood. Picture someone at 35 who has checked every box society told them to check. They have the career that pays well and commands respect. They have the relationship that looks stable from the outside. They own the house in the right neighborhood with the right fixtures, yet they feel more empty than they did at 25, when they owned nothing but possibility. The problem is that most people get trapped in the first phase. They continue using strategies that worked brilliantly in their 20s, well into their 40s and beyond. They wonder why nothing feels fulfilling anymore. They push harder toward goals that once motivated them. They accumulate more achievements that once satisfied them. But the same actions that once created meaning now create emptiness. The first half of life is about building the ego, identity, success, independence, mastery of the world around you. You test yourself against real challenges and gain confidence by proving you can handle adult responsibilities. In this stage, conformity isn't weakness, it's necessary. You follow the rules to learn how systems work. You seek approval to understand what creates connection and what causes isolation. You build power so you can later act on your own values, rather than external pressure. The ego has to become strong before it can become flexible. You must master the rules before you can break them with meaning. Only those who succeed conventionally can later reject conventional success with true freedom. But around midlife, the psyche naturally shifts toward completely different concerns. Mortality becomes real rather than abstract. Questions of meaning replace questions of achievement. Legacy replaces accumulation. Instead of asking, "How do I get what I want?" you start asking, "What wants to emerge through me?" Instead of building your individual power, you start wondering how to use whatever power you've built in service of something larger. Jung saw the second half of life as the classic time for individuation. Some post-Jungians argue the process begins earlier, but the shift happens whether you plan it or not. Your energy naturally moves away from expansion and toward depth. The achievements that once excited you start feeling hollow. The social connections that once energized you start feeling superficial. The goals that once motivated you start feeling arbitrary. This isn't depression or failure, it's psychological evolution. The skills that built your ego become obstacles to deeper fulfillment, because the second half of life requires surrendering ego dominance to serve something larger. The networking that advanced your career now feels manipulative. The competitive drive that helped you succeed now prevents collaboration. The self-promotion that built your reputation now feels inauthentic. Everything that worked before starts working against you. Think of it like learning to drive versus learning to navigate. Driving requires mastering mechanical skills, steering, braking, accelerating, following traffic laws. You practice these until they become automatic. But navigation requires completely different skills: reading maps, understanding direction, recognizing landmarks, choosing routes based on your actual destination, rather than just following the car in front of you. Someone who only knows how to drive can go very fast and handle challenging conditions, but they'll end up wherever traffic takes them. Someone who only knows how to navigate can choose meaningful destinations, but they'll never get there without driving skills. You need both, but at different times, for different purposes. The crisis comes when you keep trying to solve second-half problems with first-half solutions. You approach questions of meaning the same way you approached questions of achievement. You try to find your purpose the way you found your career. But meaning can't be pursued directly, the way goals can be pursued directly. Purpose can't be achieved the way achievements can be achieved. Take a moment and ask yourself this. Did your restlessness arrive after a success milestone? After the promotion, the degree, the relationship milestone, the house purchase? If so, your psyche might be signaling readiness for the next developmental stage. Recognizing which phase you're in transforms confusion into clarity about what your psyche actually needs right now. Instead of pushing harder with strategies that no longer fit, you can start learning the completely different skills the second half of life requires. But first, you have to face something most people spend enormous energy avoiding. The parts of yourself you've been running from might hold exactly what you need. You know that person who annoys you most, the one whose behavior triggers an almost physical reaction of irritation or disgust. Maybe they're too aggressive in meetings when you value diplomacy. Maybe they're too emotional where you pride yourself on staying rational. Maybe they're too selfish when you've built your identity around being generous and considerate. Jung discovered that our strongest emotional reactions to others often reveal the parts of ourselves we've rejected or hidden away in what he called the shadow. When someone triggers that immediate, visceral response in you, they're not just being annoying. They're reflecting back aspects of your own personality that you've spent years trying to eliminate, deny, or suppress. Often we see the shadow in others. Projection is the psyche's mirror. The very qualities you've spent years trying to eliminate from your personality may actually contain the key to your wholeness and vitality. This sounds backwards because we're taught that psychological health means getting rid of negative traits, developing positive ones, and becoming a more refined version of ourselves through constant self-improvement. But Jung realized that this approach creates internal division rather than integration. Your shadow isn't just negative traits like anger, selfishness, or aggression. It includes undeveloped talents, suppressed creativity, and authentic aspects of yourself that didn't fit your family or social environment. The artist who learned that creativity was impractical and became an accountant carries their artistic nature in the shadow. The natural leader who learned that standing out was dangerous carries their authority in the shadow. The deeply feeling person who learned that emotions were weakness carries their emotional intelligence in the shadow. Consider someone raised to be nice who buried their assertiveness completely. They learned early that expressing their needs directly made others uncomfortable, that saying no created conflict, that standing up for themselves was selfish. So they developed an identity around being accommodating, agreeable, and supportive. But their natural assertiveness didn't disappear. It got pushed into the shadow, where it operates unconsciously, creating passive-aggressive behavior, resentment toward others' demands, and exhaustion from constantly overgiving. The shadow forms through a process of psychological splitting. You learn early which parts of yourself are acceptable, and which must be hidden to maintain love and belonging. Every family has spoken and unspoken rules about what kinds of behavior, emotion, and expression are welcome. Every social environment rewards certain traits and punishes others. To survive and thrive, you adapt by developing the acceptable aspects of yourself and suppressing the unacceptable ones. This process isn't wrong or pathological. Children need to learn social skills, develop impulse control, and adapt to their environment. The problem comes when this splitting becomes so complete that you lose access to entire dimensions of your personality. You don't just learn to control your anger appropriately, you completely disconnect from your capacity for healthy anger. You don't just learn to balance self-care with generosity, you completely sacrifice your ability to prioritize your own needs. But this rejected material doesn't disappear. It continues to influence your choices, relationships, and energy levels from the unconscious realm. The suppressed assertiveness might emerge as chronic people-pleasing that leaves you feeling depleted and resentful. The hidden creativity might manifest as restlessness and dissatisfaction with practical but unfulfilling work. The shadow also influences your relationships in ways you don't recognize. You're attracted to people who express the qualities you've rejected in yourself, then become frustrated with them for having those very qualities. The overly accommodating person marries someone decisive, then resents their partner's decisiveness. The overly rational person is drawn to emotional partners, then criticizes them for being too feeling-focused. Integration doesn't mean acting out every impulse or abandoning the psychological development you've achieved. It means acknowledging and consciously relating to these disowned aspects of yourself. Instead of being unconsciously driven by shadow material, you develop the capacity to choose when and how to express different dimensions of your personality. Shadow work can be destabilizing. If the feelings feel huge, seek support. This process requires recognizing that the qualities you most judge in others often point toward your own shadow content. The person whose aggression triggers you might be showing you your own suppressed capacity for healthy assertion. The person whose emotionality annoys you might be reflecting your own disconnected feeling nature. The person whose selfishness disgusts you might be pointing toward your inability to prioritize your own legitimate needs. Feeling lost actually signals the start of your most important psychological journey. The discomfort of feeling disconnected from yourself often indicates that shadow material is ready to be reclaimed. Your psyche is telling you that the person you've tried to become is too narrow to contain who you actually are. This process of integration transforms internal conflict into internal cooperation, replacing exhausting self-management with natural self-expression. Instead of constantly monitoring and controlling yourself to maintain your acceptable identity, you can access the full range of human responses that different situations require. But how does this integration actually happen in your brain? What Jung described psychologically, modern science can now observe neurologically. When you sit quietly and let your mind wander, specific brain networks activate that don't engage during focused, goal-directed thinking. Your attention drifts from the report you're supposed to be writing to memories of last weekend, then to plans for dinner, then to worries about an upcoming conversation. This isn't distraction or mental weakness. It's your brain's default mode network coming online, running processes that shape your identity and decision-making in ways your conscious mind rarely recognizes. Jung's description of a deeper organizing center resonates with modern findings about the brain's default mode network, an empirical system neuroscience links to self-referential thought. When he talked about shadow material influencing behavior from the unconscious, he was pointing toward brain processes that neuroscience can now observe and measure directly. These self-reflective networks in your brain are constantly running background processes that your conscious mind rarely accesses, yet they shape every decision you make. While you're consciously focused on external tasks, this system is constructing narratives about who you are, what your experiences mean, and how your past connects to your future. It's not just storing information. It's actively interpreting your life story and using that interpretation to guide your choices. The default mode network links your hippocampus, which handles memory, with medial prefrontal regions that manage self-related processing and planning, and temporal regions that process identity and social cognition. These areas activate during rest, daydreaming, and self-reflection, maintaining a constant dialogue that updates your sense of self, retrieves relevant memories to inform current situations, and projects your identity into future scenarios. Think of it like a team of editors working on a manuscript that never gets finished. The memory editor pulls up relevant scenes from your past. The identity editor decides which aspects of those memories reflect who you really are. The planning editor uses that information to write the next chapter of your story. They work around the clock, revising and updating, even when you're not consciously thinking about yourself at all. This system becomes hyperactive during depression and anxiety, often creating repetitive, negative self-stories that feel completely real and unchangeable. Instead of constructing balanced narratives that integrate positive and negative experiences, the network gets stuck in loops that emphasize failure, rejection, and inadequacy. The same mechanism that usually helps you learn from experience starts generating distorted interpretations that reinforce psychological suffering. Someone experiencing depression might have a minor social interaction that goes slightly wrong. Then watch their default mode network construct an entire narrative about how this proves they're fundamentally unlikable. The memory editor pulls up every similar experience from the past. The identity editor decides this pattern reveals their true nature. The planning editor projects this identity into future scenarios, creating expectations of continued rejection. But the same network that generates psychological suffering also contains the capacity for insight, creativity, and what Jung called active imagination. When this system operates in a balanced way, it can generate new perspectives on old problems, connect seemingly unrelated experiences in meaningful ways, and produce creative solutions that conscious thinking alone can't achieve. The difference isn't in the network itself, but in how consciously you relate to its processes. Evidence suggests that regular introspective practices strengthen connections between conscious and self-referential regions. Meditation, journaling, and dream attention have been associated with more integrated brain signaling. When you spend time observing your thought patterns, emotional reactions, and behavioral tendencies without immediately judging or changing them, you're developing the neural pathways that allow conscious awareness to influence unconscious processes. The default mode network continues operating, but it becomes more responsive to conscious input, rather than running completely on autopilot. The integration Jung described creates new pathways between rational analysis and intuitive knowing. Areas responsible for logical thinking develop stronger connections with areas that process emotional information and bodily sensations. Instead of these different types of intelligence operating in isolation, they start working together to provide more complete information for decision-making. Someone who has developed this integration doesn't just think their way through decisions, or just follow their gut instincts. They can access both analytical thinking and intuitive wisdom simultaneously, using rational analysis to evaluate options while staying connected to their deeper sense of what feels right and aligned with their authentic nature. Modern neuroscience confirms Jung's century-old insights about self-awareness. Your brain is designed for the kind of conscious-unconscious dialogue that individuation requires. The neural architecture exists for integration between different levels of mental processing. The capacity for self-reflection isn't just psychological luxury, it's how your brain is structured to function optimally. Understanding this biological foundation makes the journey toward wholeness feel less mystical and more like cooperating with your brain's natural architecture. But there's one factor that accelerates this integration more than any practice or technique. Something most people spend enormous energy avoiding, yet it may be precisely what transforms surface-level existence into authentic living. You have a finite span of days. Jung argued the awareness of mortality shifts life's questions from achievement to meaning. When you truly grasp your finite nature, the psychological tasks that seem so important in the first half of life start looking different. The promotion you've been chasing, the social status you've been building, the approval you've been seeking, all of it becomes secondary to the question of how you want to spend your actual days. Many people avoid thinking about death. Jungian writers and clinicians argue that this avoidance can delay the deeper questions that prompt individuation. We structure entire lives around the unconscious belief that if we just accumulate enough achievements, possessions, or recognition, we can somehow make ourselves permanent. We live as if mortality is a problem to be solved, rather than a condition that gives urgency and meaning to our choices. The avoidance shows up everywhere. We stay busy to avoid reflection. We focus on external goals to avoid internal questions. We surround ourselves with distractions that prevent us from feeling the weight of our limited time. But this strategy backfires because it prevents us from making the kinds of choices that actually matter when time is short. When you truly internalize your finite time, trivial concerns naturally fall away, and essential priorities become crystal clear. Arguments that once consumed hours of mental energy suddenly seem pointless. Social obligations that once felt mandatory become optional. Work that pays well but drains your soul becomes obviously unsustainable. The clarifying effect happens not through force or discipline, but through genuine recognition of what deserves your irreplaceable days. Consider how people facing terminal illness often report feeling more alive and authentic than they have in years, not despite their mortality, but because of it. When time becomes obviously limited, pretending becomes impossible. Social performance drops away. People-pleasing stops making sense. The energy that was scattered across dozens of should-dos and have-tos gets focused on what actually matters to them. These individuals don't suddenly become different people. They become more themselves because they stop wasting energy on maintaining versions of themselves that never felt real in the first place. The approaching deadline forces a kind of authenticity that most people never achieve because they live as if they have unlimited time to figure things out later. Death anxiety drives much of what we call success. The unconscious belief that achievements, possessions, or recognition can somehow make us permanent shapes decisions in ways we rarely acknowledge. We work toward goals that promise security, build careers that offer stability, accumulate possessions that feel substantial. But underneath these rational motivations runs the irrational hope that if we just achieve enough, we can somehow transcend our temporal limitations. This creates a kind of psychological hamster wheel, where no amount of external success feels sufficient because it's trying to solve an unsolvable problem. You can't accumulate your way out of mortality. You can't achieve permanence through temporary accomplishments. The anxiety remains because the strategy is fundamentally flawed. Jung suggested that accepting impermanence actually liberates you to live more fully, because you stop trying to control outcomes and start engaging with what matters. When you genuinely accept that your time is limited and your ultimate fate is uncertain, the pressure to make everything work out perfectly disappears. You can invest energy in relationships, creative expression, and meaningful contribution without needing to guarantee specific results. This acceptance doesn't create despair or hopelessness. It creates freedom from the exhausting project of trying to make yourself invulnerable. You can take risks because you're going to die anyway. You can be authentic because approval won't save you. You can pursue what matters to you because playing it safe offers no real protection. What happens when you stop trying to fix yourself and start becoming who you already are? Embracing mortality transforms the question from "how do I become successful?" to "how do I become real?" Success implies achieving something external that will solve internal problems. Reality implies expressing something internal regardless of external outcomes. This reframe eliminates the exhausting project of self-improvement and replaces it with the more natural process of self-revelation. Instead of working to become a better version of yourself, you work to become a more honest version of yourself. But this authenticity doesn't emerge through endless self-reflection or solitary contemplation. It reveals itself through something far more immediate and demanding. Authentic relationship becomes the laboratory where your true nature reveals itself. The self is relational. Jung understood that individuation depends on relationships, not isolation. You exist most fully not in solitary self-reflection, but in the moments when you act from your deepest truth in relationship with others. The person who spends hours journaling about their authentic self, but never expresses that authenticity in their actual interactions, remains trapped in psychological narcissism. Excessive private reflection becomes another form of ego performance, unless it translates into relational deeds. The insights stay locked in private notebooks while their daily relationships continue operating from the same patterns of performance and people-pleasing that created their sense of disconnection in the first place. Jung emphasized that the self reveals itself through your deeds, choices, and authentic engagement with the world, though he sometimes recommended detachment to allow objectivity. You don't think your way into wholeness. You act your way into it through making choices that align with your deepest nature, especially when those choices require courage, vulnerability, or the risk of disappointing others who expect you to remain the same. The paradox is that many people seeking self-discovery become trapped in narcissistic self-focus, missing the fact that individuation is fundamentally about learning to serve something larger than your ego. They read books about finding themselves, attend workshops about discovering their purpose, spend years in therapy exploring their inner landscape. But all this inward attention can become another form of ego building if it never translates into more authentic ways of being with other people. True individuation doesn't create more self-centered people. It creates people who are so grounded in their authentic nature that they can give freely without depleting themselves, set boundaries without aggression, and love others without losing themselves in the process. The person who has done this inner work becomes more available for real relationship, not less. The self emerges when you stop asking, "What do I want?" and start asking, "What wants to emerge through me?" This shift moves you from ego-driven desire towards something more like vocation. Instead of trying to get something from your relationships and circumstances, you start wondering what you're meant to contribute to them. Consider how your most meaningful moments often involve forgetting yourself completely. In deep conversation, when you're so engaged with understanding another person that your self-consciousness disappears. In creative flow, when you lose track of time because you're completely absorbed in bringing something into existence. In acts of service that feel naturally aligned with who you are, where helping others doesn't feel like sacrifice but like the most natural expression of your energy. These moments share a common quality. Your ego steps back and something larger operates through you. You're not performing a role or trying to create an impression. You're simply present and responsive, acting from your center without the usual layer of self-conscious calculation. Jung warned against what he called anti-individuation, the tendency to either merge unconsciously with group identity or withdraw into isolated self-absorption. Both responses avoid the real challenge of becoming genuinely yourself while remaining genuinely connected to others. Real intimacy requires showing up as who you actually are and dealing with whatever response that generates, including disappointment, conflict, or the discovery that some relationships can't survive your authenticity. True individuation creates what Jung called ethical responsibility. This isn't following moral rules imposed from outside, but developing the capacity to act from your authentic center while remaining genuinely connected to others. You become responsible not just for your own psychological development, but for how that development affects the people around you. This means owning the impact of your growth on your relationships. When you stop people-pleasing, some people will be upset about losing the benefits of your overgiving. When you start setting boundaries, some people will push back against the limits you're establishing. When you begin expressing opinions you previously kept to yourself, some people will disagree or feel challenged by your new directness. Ethical responsibility means acknowledging these impacts while staying committed to your authentic expression. You don't become cruelly selfish, but you also don't sacrifice your growth to manage other people's reactions. You learn to be genuinely yourself in ways that honor both your own development and your care for others. Try one small relational experiment this week. Speak a quiet truth to a trusted person and notice the outcome. This isn't about becoming more selfish, but about becoming more genuinely yourself so you can offer something real to your relationships and community. Your feelings of disconnection might be the beginning of your greatest transformation. The loneliness that feels like isolation might actually be preparation for deeper intimacy. The dissatisfaction with surface-level interaction might indicate readiness for more meaningful engagement. This transformation turns loneliness into solitude, people-pleasing into genuine care, and social performance into natural self-expression. You stop relating to others through the exhausting filter of who you think you should be and start engaging from who you actually are. But this shift requires understanding something fundamental about the nature of feeling lost itself. Feeling lost becomes a signal to begin remembering the organizing center you've always had. The discomfort isn't evidence that something is wrong with you. It's information that your conscious life has drifted away from your deeper nature. Jung spent his life mapping this territory, not because he thought everyone should become a psychologist, but because he believed individuated people create a more humane world. When you align with your authentic nature rather than fighting against it, you contribute something irreplaceable to the collective human experience. If you found value here, hit that thumbs up and subscribe to Meaningful Odyssey to join the journey as we discover wisdom, and navigate life's complexities together.